Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're unpacking some absolutely fascinating and honestly pretty chilling source material that asks a massive question. Are we currently sitting on a sinking ship when it comes to our personal freedoms? We'll be diving into a recent analysis that draws heavily on a speech by tech founder Pavel Durov, alongside some really sharp insights from legal expert Valérie Bugault. Now, Durov uses this incredibly striking historical comparison to describe what he sees happening globally right now. He actually compares the current state of our freedoms to the sinking of the Titanic. So let's dive right into this and see exactly what he means. What really stood out in the sources is the actual timeline of that fateful night. When the Titanic hit the iceberg, the passengers didn't panic immediately. In fact, they literally ignored the danger for almost 2 hours. They had been told the ship was unsinkable, so they just didn't believe there was a real threat. And because of that false sense of security, those initial lifeboats left the ship half empty. It was only in the last half hour that people finally realized the sheer gravity of the situation. But by then, it was just too late. And this brings us straight to Durov's central warning. He argues that our ship has already hit the iceberg. According to his analysis, we've already started to sink without even realizing it. The overarching argument presented in the source material is that freedoms are being eroded globally almost without exception, and the general public is just sitting in silence. Much like the passengers on that doomed ship, were entirely unaware of the water rushing in below deck. Okay, Section 1, the Titanic Syndrome, Erosion of Freedoms. To set the stage here, the sources lay out some staggering statistics. They point to thousands of digital arrests happening across the UK for social media posts, and similar arrests in Germany for just insulting politicians online, painting a picture of a rapidly rising culture of fear and anonymity. Moving on to Section 2. The emotional hijack, chat control. The sources pivot here to a deeply controversial initiative pushed by the European Commission, which essentially aims to mandate backdoors into all our private encryption and require ID verification. This raises a totally crucial question from the source material. Why use child protection as a pretext for mass surveillance? Under the Chat Control Initiative, the official justification is protecting youth. Now, obviously, protecting kids is universally paramount, right? But the sources argue these specific policies historically fail. They point to Russia's attempt to ban Telegram. The data there shows 95% of Russian teenagers simply bypass the ban using VPNs. The sources highlight a seriously dangerous unintended consequence. Once kids are pushed onto VPNs, they're suddenly exposed to a wild west of unfiltered, illegal, and far more dangerous corners of the internet. So if the policy is known to fail at its stated goal, why push it? Well, privately, a very different motive emerged. This quote here is literally pulled from the British government's own submission to the High Court of England regarding their Online Safety Act. They openly admitted that the principal part of the act was aimed at capturing large platforms with significant influence over public discourse. The source material argues this is a huge aha moment. It reveals that the goal isn't actually about child safety, it's about gaining control over political speech online. What's truly fascinating is the psychology behind this tactic. The sources define this as emotional hijacking. By invoking child protection, it triggers our deepest, most protective instincts. I mean, who would possibly be against protecting children? Nobody. But the sources argue that authoritarian regimes have historically used this exact emotional bypass. By triggering ancient, deep fears, it completely bypasses logic, debate, and rationality, allowing officials to essentially smuggle in oppressive surveillance laws designed to read every private message and map every single thought. This brings us to a timeless warning from Benjamin Franklin, illustrating that trading essential liberty for temporary safety is ultimately a scam. To really back this up, the explainer sources share a frankly shocking anecdote from France. A French tax bureaucrat was caught stealing and selling the personal financial data of citizens to criminals. Because of this massive data hoarding, the sources note a catastrophic rise in kidnappings in France, citing over 40 victims in just the first 3 months of the year 2026 alone. The core argument here is that handing governments massive databases of your private information doesn't inherently keep you safe. In many cases, it actually puts a target right on your back. Let's look at Section 3, Law as a Weapon, the Death of the Rule of Law. The sources bring in legal expert Valérie Bugault, who offers a really stark diagnosis. Our classical rule of law is essentially dead. Bugault calls this concept lawfare, or legal warfare. The sources describe this as a tactic where a massive number of mutually exclusive and totally contradictory regulations are introduced by a financial oligarchy. The result? Compliance becomes literally impossible. It's like a giant trap. This means that, technically speaking, every entrepreneur or citizen is a criminal under some obscure rule. The government can then selectively prosecute only those who refuse to bend to political demands or who dare to stand up for constitutional rights, while completely turning a blind eye to those who play along. To illustrate this kind of selective enforcement, the source points to a massive €120 million fine. Durov specifically claims in his speech that this happened after Elon Musk refused a secret deal from the European Commission to censor inconvenient political narratives. When Musk supposedly refused to comply with this censorship demand, his company was suddenly slapped with this massive, seemingly unrelated fine for transparency issues. The sources present this as a modern, textbook example of lawfare in action. Which leads us to Section 4, the digital gulag, AI surveillance. Durov shares a harrowing personal anecdote from 2024 involving his translator, a woman who had actually fled the Soviet Union in the 1980s. After witnessing his 3-day interrogation in Paris, that same translator looked at the police officers and said she felt the Soviet Union was catching up to her right there in a French judge's office. The sources argue we're actually facing something much worse than the 80s Soviet Union. Back then, the KGB was physically limited, right? There were only so many officers and only so many physical letters they could literally steam open. But today, with initiatives like chat control and modern AI surveillance, there is zero human limit. Every single draft, message, thought, and relationship can be instantly analyzed and mapped out. The sources warned that this lack of physical limitation makes the modern digital surveillance state infinitely more dystopian than the historical KGB. So what do? Section 5. The local solution, rebuilding the ship. Durov points out something absolutely crucial. There is no second West or backup civilization we can just flee to. We don't have lifeboats. Therefore, we literally have to fix the ship we are currently on. The specific solution proposed in the source material is a project called Art Évolue Droit, which translates to the renewal and evolution of law. Now, the sources heavily emphasize that this is definitely not a call for a violent revolution. Instead, it's a concrete, grassroots movement designed to reconstruct society and push back against what they term financial totalitarianism, basically by returning to the foundational principles of classical natural law. To actually pull this off, the sources outline a very specific 3-step action plan for citizens. Step 1 is to reclaim power at the local municipal level, the commune, which they view as the absolute bedrock of citizen sovereignty. Step 2 is to get actively engaged and prepare for the upcoming 2026 municipal elections to put these ideas into real practice. And Step 3 is the big one, rebuilding our institutions based on classical natural law, creating a system that actually serves and protects the citizen rather than endlessly surveilling them. The central takeaway from all this source material is that if the law no longer liberates you, it has become a weapon. And if it's a weapon, it's totally up to the citizens to take it back. The future isn't written yet. The call to action here is super clear. Stay vigilant, stay engaged, and work to fix the ship of freedom before it sinks to the bottom. It really leaves us with a provocative question, doesn't it? Are we going to be the passengers who ignore the iceberg, or are we going to roll up our sleeves and start patching the hull? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and I really hope it gave you a lot to think about.